Hi guys, thanks for joining us this morning. We're actually here, we're doing a bit of a live stream here almost. And this is a forerunner to the macro exam, which is of course in just a little over, I think it's 10 days, is it Dylan? A little over 10 days, yeah, Dylan there, DR. And we're going to run through some of the key topics which might hopefully appear on the macro paper. We were just discussing before we went live here, we were just discussing the micro paper, and what a coincidence it was that just before that paper we were talking about Crossrail and public-private finance initiatives and so on and so forth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that was just by sheer coincidence. So I've been through kind of the press for the last 12 to 18 months, had a look at what the prevailing macro topics are, and those are probably the topic areas which the examiners in the last 12 to 18 months will have been looking at and thinking, how can we put together some sort of examination based upon these topics. So the first one, I've got four here, I've ended up with four, and we're just having a little brainstorm as to what things might most likely occur and the sort of questions that you might most likely be asked. And here they are, and we're going to start today with inflation and interest rates. So guys, anything that we've missed out here particularly? Anything spring to mind? I've just been sort of randomly firing these things up. No, everyone's quite happy with what we've got here. So what we'll do is we'll run around these and just talk about them, draw the relevant diagrams where necessary, and sort of elaborate upon the theories. So let's start with the very basics then. So I think the very basic thing that we have missed out here is, of course, that you would want to be able to give the definition of inflation. So a sustained rise in the price level measured in percentage terms. And of course, most commonly we are using the CPI index. And in the last week, of course, we had our little GME performance last week with year 12. And Dylan, at the moment, the inflation rate, the CPI number, 9%. The highest in 40 years, Dylan, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got very rapidly rising inflation at the moment. And I think, Nathan, about 3/4 of that most recent increase is due to what?
The energy price.
Yes, the energy price cap. And of course, we've just seen this morning on the news the announcement that Rishi is probably going to intervene more substantially than we previously thought to try to bring those energy prices down. The target for inflation, Manisha?
2%.
2%. Target of 2. We're currently at 9, so we're way off the target. And of course, Manisha, it's a bit more than just 2, isn't it? It's a symmetrical target, so that means
Plus or minus 1%.
okay, plus or minus 1% either side. So plus 1 or minus 1. So if it's 3%, it's within target. If it's 1%, it's still within target. Okay, so we've got this inflation target. It's currently at 9. We would obviously want to be bringing it hopefully back towards target. And that is the job of the MPC, not the marginal propensity to consume.
The monetary policy.
The Monetary Policy Committee, correct. Monetary Policy Committee. And that's made up of a group of wise men and women, of course, although it is predominantly men, 7 men and 2 women currently sitting on the Monetary Policy Committee. But they meet, of course, and it's their job to determine the base rate and decide whether or not it needs to go up or down to come back to try to bring inflation back to target. Now, the current rate of interest at the moment, the interest rate, so the base rate, Nathan, sitting at
0.75.
not quite. Manisha? 1. Yeah. Currently sitting at 1%. Now, of course, relative to when I was your age and I was doing my A levels, that's very, very low. We've had very, very low rates of interest for 20 odd years. But yeah, it is increasing, and obviously further increases are expected in order to try to bring inflation back to its target. That might be problematic given the different types of inflation that you will hopefully be aware of. So, Dylan, different types would be?
Disinflation.
Okay, maybe I've written the wrong phrase there, Dylan. Maybe I should talk about causes.
Cost push.
Okay, right. Yeah. So we've got our cost push. Go on. Demand pull. And cost push, demand pull, excessive growth of the money supply, called monetary. We've got cost push, demand pull, and monetary. And which one of those, Nathan, are we struggling to cope with at the moment?
Cost push.
Okay, so we're struggling with this one. We're certainly not struggling too much with demand pull, given the very tight and severe cost of living squeeze that we're experiencing at the moment. And has there been an expansion of the money supply in recent years? In recent, almost we're into decades now actually of a certain process going on in the economy called QE. QE. And that stands for quantitative easing. Quantitative easing. And we've had many rounds of quantitative easing, and we're almost up to how much quantitative easing by the central bank, by the Bank of England. It's almost up to, but not quite, £1 trillion worth of QE has gone into the economy. It's 900 and something. I think it's 975 billion, but I stand to be corrected on that, but I know it's close to £1 trillion. Okay, so those are our three types. So let's now just get clear in our heads of the diagrams that we would use for each of these. So Manisha, if it was cost push, we would be illustrating that by okay, or if we're talking more in terms of kind of just your traditional AS diagram, AS shifting to the left, precisely, really good. So if it was cost push, we'd have AS, going AS1 to AS2, there's AD1, so you're going Y1 to Y2. Hope you can see this, viewers, hope you can see it, hope it's big enough for you, but you get the general gist. By this stage in your A levels, I'm sure you're well aware of all of these different diagrams. So this is a bit of a nasty one, and don't forget this. This is a bit of a nasty one because not only is it inflationary, but it's also reducing the size of the real economy. So the price level is rising, but the real economy is also contracting. So that's a bit of a nasty consequence really of cost push inflation. Whereas, Dylan, if we were talking the second one, demand pull inflation, AD would be shifting to the right. So AD1 going to AD2. P1 would be going to P2, Y1 to Y2. So in some respects, this is not quite so bad because we've got the price level going up, okay, so that's inflation, but at least we have a little bit of economic growth going on there because we've got that increase in the level of real output. Now, Manisha, you were talking about trade-offs, so that's a great, this diagram, Manisha, even though we're not using the traditional Keynesian aggregate supply curve, this is a great example of the trade-off between growth and inflation, exactly. So we're getting that real economic growth but we're having to accept a little bit of inflation. So we've got that trade-off happening there. And of course, you can see that more clearly when we use our KAS, Keynesian Aggregate Supply Curve, and shift AD around kind of the curve. So Y1 to Y2, P1 to P2. So we've got inflation, but at least we've got some growth. So there's our growth, but there's our inflation. So we've got that trade-off happening. Now, just by way of evaluation, and of course evaluation is really important in exams, if we think back to the, ever since the financial crash, when successive governments have been trying to grow the economy and get real output increasing and stimulating the economy, be that through low interest rates or tax cuts or increasing quantitative easing, what we haven't seen is, until now, we haven't seen a rapid ramp up of inflation in those sort of years between, say, 2009, 2010, all the way through to, the pandemic, when obviously that's exceptional circumstance, really. So that kind of trade, that's a great evaluative point, just to mention, well, yes, Philip says that we will see this trade-off, but actually in reality, have we seen it? That's debatable. We're seeing it at the moment, but of course at the minute we've got stagflation, rising unemployment, and so no, we're not, have we? We haven't got stagflation at the minute. Unemployment's at 3.7%, but we do have this very rapidly expanding inflationary pressure. So that's our demand pull diagram. And then we've got this monetary inflation. So Manisha, you were talking the other day and you're saying, can we just maybe have another little think about quantitative easing and the way in which QE actually works? So shall we do that? So, sort of the various steps associated with QE. So you can break it down into sort of 4 or 5 fairly straightforward steps. At your stage, of course, you might want to supplement this with some diagrams to go alongside of it. But the basic gist of it is the Bank of England buys what from whom, Nathan?
Is it bonds from the government?
From. So you're right to say that the Bank of England is buying
from banks.
Okay, so buying bonds. I mean, more recently, and that's a more interesting argument to get into, as to whether or not the Bank of England has just been basically funding the government's borrowing during the pandemic. You'll remember at one point during the pandemic, the government needed to borrow 400 billion, and all of a sudden, the Bank of England said, we're going to do QE of 400 billion-ish. And that then led to a bit of a discussion about the independence of the central bank relative to the government, which is what David Smith, of course, was writing about on Sunday. I'm not sure if I sent you his article this week. But yeah, the BOE, certainly back in the sort of the financial crash, so the BOE buys bonds, and certainly during the financial crash, that was, we're talking about from the retail banks, the RBs, and kind of investment houses. So the Bank of England gets the bonds, so the retail banks, Dylan, in return, they get the cash, the liquidity. If you remember, we talked about the financial crash being a credit crunch, a liquidity, crisis of liquidity. So the retail banks, they have increased deposits, essentially. And we know, Nathan, that they operate on this cash deposit ratio, which means if we deposit some money with the retail bank, they'll keep some of it and
They'll lend the rest of it.
okay, so the expectation and the hope was that these increased deposits would lead to increased loans.
Are those left just for the central bank to borrow those deposits?
Say that again.
Do you know how the central bank, the retail banks keep some deposits with them?
Yeah.
Is that reserved just for the central bank?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
I get the bond.
So where are we up to here?
Before, let's say, second point.
So the retail banks have increased. So it's because, so if you're the Halifax and I'm the Bank of England and you've got £100 worth of bonds, so I buy the bonds, so you give me your bonds and I give you £100,
Oh, right.
right? Then you got that and then you'll keep £10 of it and you'll lend the other 90.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've got the increased loans to, you know, consumers, hopefully, and firms. And the hope, of course, is that what do they do with that? They spend it, so it leads to increased AD essentially, and economic growth. So this is an electronic way of kind of creating deposits and creating money essentially. Now there were, again, if you were thinking about our exams here and we want to evaluate, there were a number of reasons why this was not successful, or maybe not as successful as would have been anticipated. So can you think of kind of some of the reasons or the evaluative points as to why ultimately this was maybe not as successful as it might have otherwise been? So our EV points for QE. What got the banks into bother in the first place? Lending too much. Therefore, even though the Bank of England said, oh, here's some more money, lend it, they're like, whoa, we've just, many of the banks have almost gone bust. They've been the government's had to step in to prop them up. And so even though they had this, they were still very reluctant to lend as a consequence. So there's a real reluctance. Once bitten, twice shy type of thing. Similarly, consumers and firms who'd overstretched themselves in the run-up to the financial crash, again, same sort of thing. They were too cautious. They thought, well, you take out more loans, you must be joking. So again, there was that reluctance from your consumers and the firms, sort of CNI component of AD, essentially. Thirdly, financial regulation in the wake of the financial crisis obviously was ramped up, and in order to ensure that the retail banks could actually say to the central bank, oh well, actually we now meet this tighter criteria, they had to hold on to that money, and so it was in their interest actually to just hold on to the money and not lend it out, because it meant that they were able to meet this stricter criteria in terms of how much cash they had in reserve, etc. So the banks themselves, they preferred really to just hold on to the cash. To hold on to it. I mean, there are other, we'll maybe come back to this, but not certainly for now. We can leave it at that. Now, if you wanted to illustrate monetary, what sort of diagram would be popping into your head there?
Transmission.
Right, okay, perfecto, yes, the TM, which leads us very nicely. Wow, you'd think that I'd designed this intentionally. So the transmission mech, okay, so we've got our money market, our investment demands, and then our real output. So there's our money supply 1, money supply 2. Apologies for maybe whizzing through this slightly, but again, as I say, you're all days away from your exam, so hopefully this is all old hat to you. Interest rate drops because you've increased the money supply. Investment demand ramps up because the interest rate's now lower. And real output then obviously AD. AD shifts from AD1 to AD2, and there we have it. So that essentially is a sort of diagrammatical structure that you'd maybe want to be working along for that. So great diagrams transmission mechanism to use. Thoroughly recommend those to you, really. Dylan, how would we just take that sort of one step further and just show this idea of crowding out as well? So, do you remember what crowding out is? So when the public sector essentially gets too big and there's not enough room for the the private sector, it gets crowded out. So when we've got higher demand, means you've got more. If you think about your transactionary, precautionary, speculative demands for money, what happens to the demand for money curve? It'll shift right. You end up at MD2. Interest rate then's gone back up. So investment might drop off a bit, and then AD might also drop off a bit. You sort of end up going boom, 81 to 2, but then back to 3. Okay. What about then the ability to? Is that okay? Am I going too fast? Just.
You know the red lines that happens after AD shifts right. So that's
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. What about the ability to? I mean, you can always, when I upload this, you can play it back hundreds of times, thousands of times maybe, and you can pause it, etc., etc. What about what could we say about the ability to manage? Now, when I say that, what I mean is the ability of the central bank to manage the type and the cause of inflation. So, I just thought of another thing, the costs as well, put that in. But what about this ability to manage it? So at the moment, we've got inflation. And we talked about this on GME last week, but even on the press this morning, some of the Financial Times, FT for Schools, some of the Financial Times things that I'm reading this morning were also mentioning the key drivers of our inflation at the moment. So key drivers at the moment would be still Brexit, the pandemic. Now the pandemic is very much on the supply side problems. Obviously, number 3, the crisis in the Ukraine. And the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, as they talk about, and the fact that price of wheat, etc., is soaring. We've had those terrible 50-degree temperatures in India, and India, again, mass producer of wheat, has actually banned the export of wheat. So again, that's compromising the global supply of wheat, so that the supply side shock there creates the upside pressure on inflation. So you've got all these things. Now, who's trying to control this? The Monetary Policy Committee. And what's their normal sort of reaction, their tool, their instrument? It's, well, we're going to raise the base rate. Well, we've got to say a couple of things about this. The first thing is, if they raise the base rate in the UK, what will that do, and will that have any impact on the supply side constraints, the problems of Brexit, and the kind of the fallout from the Ukraine? Probably not. So as Andrew Bailey he said, quoted, was saying a couple of weeks ago at the kind of the previous MPC meeting, there is very little that the Bank of England can do to protect UK consumers from the current 9% inflation. On one hand. But where they can help, although it's going to be painful probably, and again it's been written about in the press this morning, we know at the minute that there are more job vacancies than there are people looking for jobs. So that means that we've got a very, very what labour market. Now I know this is slightly micro, but we've got a very,
There's more vacancies than there is people looking for jobs.
yeah, what's that called? Tight.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got a very tight labour market at the moment. And it means that those people who do have jobs, I was reading one of the big law firms in London, they've just raised their starting salary for a solicitor or a lawyer to 164,000 starting. Right, unbelievable. 164,000. And this tight labour market is putting the power into the hands of the employees. Now, if you're an employee, you then will start to anticipate that in the future, Manisha, you will continue to get very,
Like a wage account.
yeah, you will then anticipate, oh wow, because we've got this very tight labour market, the power is in my hands, and people in the economy will start to think, well, wages and prices, they're just going to keep soaring. Now that is so dangerous, as you know, because as Milton Friedman, so tight labour market, Milton Friedman, as Milton Friedman said, or as his theory says, and talked about this idea of expectations, and if people come to expect inflation, then we don't get any kind of any short-run deviation from the natural rate of unemployment. All that happens is that any attempts to increase AD, we simply ramp up the Nauru points, if you recall, on your Phillips curve diagrams. And we'll come to the diagram in a minute. So what people think is happening at the minute, and what the central bank has said this morning is, I've written tough love here. And what they're saying is, we're actually going to have to deliberately put some people out of work to try and bring wage expectations down and to try and lower inflationary expectations. The reason being is that we have this very low inflation rate. Very few people now sort of frictionally unemployed, and we need to bring down inflation. And this very phrase was used in the FT this morning. I can't remember which article it was. I've tweeted it, followers, but you'll be able to see that there. And basically, they're trying to say that they're going to try to induce almost a recession that will cause unemployment. And then people's expectations about wages and prices will start to come down as well. So it's this idea of expectations is really, certainly the way we sit at the minute, is really important. And again, if you think about what the Chancellor's about to announce today with regard to the wider support package in terms of the cost of living, what he's going to do is he's going to bring people's bills down maybe by a few £100s a year. Well, if you're a firm, you're not going to expect energy costs to keep going up, so they're trying to manage expectations and to try and bring those expectations down again. So it's all about managing those expectations. So I didn't realise I'd written it there, but yeah, so really, really sort of key expectations. So we talked very briefly there about Nauru and the Phillips curves. So hopefully springing into your head will be, so here's inflation, here's unemployment, A to B, back to C, C to D to E. Now Dylan, which of those points are on the Nauru? Yeah. So A's on the Nauru, C's on the Nauru, E's on the Nauru. And as Friedman was pointing out when he was talking about this theory is if people come to expect inflation, then all that happens is you just keep jumping up this long run Phillips curve, or the classical aggregate supply curve as it is, with no deviations, no kind of benefits, trade-offs in terms of the level of real output. Okay. Now, as we were talking through this, so this popped into my head, just the costs of inflation. Now, obviously, that would be a sort of a much simpler kind of idea, really. But when we're talking about the costs of inflation, we'd be thinking about the menu costs, the shoe leather costs, the fiscal drag, those types of things. I'll not go into those because it's really GCSE stuff, menu, shoe leather, fiscal drag, etc. Fiscal drag obviously being quite a prominent one, particularly given that the Chancellor's frozen the thresholds, so you're going to get more people dragged into the higher tax bands when they're getting like 7, 8, 9% pay rises sort of thing. If only 7, 8 or 9% pay rise. And then lastly, just to finish, and then, if you've anything you want to add, just shout. So just to mention really, we've talked here about this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, but Sir Mervyn King, in his book, The End of Alchemy, talked about the nice decade, was it the 97 to 2007, but the period of time when we had non-inflationary continuous expansion, which seemed to sort of blow a hole in that theory that you must have rising inflation if you want more economic growth, essentially. The nice decade, I think it was called the nice decade. I think he refers to it as that in his book. So those would be our kind of main key points, I think, on inflation and interest rates, and certainly given what's gone on in the last 12, 24 months, you might anticipate that as a question in your exam.
So it's a nice like an evaluation for the
Yeah. So to say that, yes, the Phillips curve states that we would have this trade-off, but actually look back at what's happened in the real world. I mean, this is globally, not just in the UK. Massive amounts of QE pumped into the economy, government spending, and for many, many years until obviously now, but it's slightly, the causes are different. We haven't seen this massive spike in inflation as Keynes's theory would suggest.
You talked about crowding out with the transition mechanism, how they'll work.
Yeah, I didn't. The only way I just threw it in there is simply because it's something that you can use these diagrams to illustrate crowding out. It's not necessarily something that you would kind of associate with the stuff that you want to talk about here.
And how do you show the crowding out with that?
So if you were, I mean, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be asked to discuss crowding out. But if it comes into some sort of question that you get, well, you would use those diagrams to illustrate. But it's simply because we had those diagrams drawn, I just thought, well, now's a nice opportunity to mention it really. Anything else before we move on to the next one? Okay. 34 minutes.